the front, on the top, on the right as you looked at it. And it was heartbreaking because some of those people I'd met personally, and there was one guy, he always seemed to be looking at me. And he must have retired, so maybe he's slightly older than me. He must have come back to work, and he was taken away by COVID. So although they were anglicizing their names, you hear things like Roberto, that's a Nigerian, that's another Nigerian, that's another Nigerian, those are my people. Then you start to wonder about yourself, because you're thinking, well, is it something specific about Nigerians that is increasing the risk of this trouble? So when you go to work, for example, you're wondering whether, even if you don't get it, are you going to bring it home? So it was a very difficult time. And those who were lucky, and I know there are people in this room who had it, and those who were lucky staggered out of hospital between guards of honor, mounted by exhausted nurses, but relieved that their patient had survived. And it seemed that our people bore the brunt of the first wave of COVID. The waves changed later on, but that first wave did a lot of havoc. And when you consider that the estimates of the population, or the proportion of ethnic minority staff in the NHS is about 13, 63% of the people who died during the first wave were ethnic minorities, so 63%. 12% population, 63% died. So the question is, why? Why did this happen? And this is when noise for vendor mouth started. Yeah? Those of you who are of my vintage will know it. If you don't know it, you haven't been educated. Anyway, so noise for vendor mouth started next, please. Which is, people started to talk, they start to yap. It's because it's genetics. It's the way they're made. There's a guy in the 19th century America who predicted that African people were so inferior that they were destined to extinction. So they were saying things like that. Well, it's just one of those things. The pandemic comes and it takes the weakest. They said things like, it's the environment, it's multi-generational living, or it's the jobs they do, or the skin's too dark, so they can't vitamin D, they can't get the vitamin D and it's a risk factor, or they're poor because they're ill, or they're ill because they're poor. So they came up with all these explanations. But one of the more cogent correlates or comorbidities that seemed to increase the risk of dying or developing complications from COVID there were two things: hypertension and diabetes. That seemed undoubted that it was contributed. So we concede that in spite of all the vendor noise, they were right at times. And hypertension, please, is silent. You won't know. There are very few people that I know as friends who haven't got hypertension. My dad had it, my mom had it. It was sad at the time because he was in a position, particularly my dad, he was in a position to be able to acquire. In fact, I made the diagnosis. I went home in 1983. I think it was 1983. And it's the dad-son thing, where you don't just touch your dad anyhow. And I remember thinking, I'm getting on a bit. I should be able to just cross the threshold. He is a doctor. He's formidable. My dad is formidable. And so I said, look, can I check your blood pressure? And I checked his blood pressure and it was crazy. So he started to take tablets, but he was fortunate because he could. Some of his friends, professors and so on, who were not in a position to acquire the treatment, they were sharing tablets, they were splitting tablets, they were alternating tablets. They would take Nigerian made, then overseas made, and so on. So it's caused a lot of havoc. And a lot of my cousins, I have a cousin who's since departed himself. He was in America, and his blood pressure got to a point where it was uncontrollable. They had a party with my brother in Atlanta, and he was there, and I rang them, and we spent an hour on the phone discussing this cousins. He's the second cousin, really. But this cousin's blood pressure, what do we do? He said, I've had that. He's a doctor. He was a doctor himself. What is, I've had that, I've had this, I've had that. Anyway, to cut a long story short, it caused him a lot of trouble. And it caused his mum a problem, because his mum had a stroke. In fact, I learned from this cousin who's since departed, I'm digress a bit, because my wife always says, when I'm late from work, you'll be talking again. Yeah, so the issue is, he taught me, that cousin taught me how to, I'm not sure I'm good at it, but he taught me how to compartmentalize. And what that means is his mother was one of the most gregarious people you could imagine. She knew, she had relatives, she had Quaker relatives. Yeah, I don't know whether that's yours, but she had Quaker relatives, she had this, and she would go around everybody. She used to come to Igobi and say, oh, did you know she was related to Baba Shukui? So she had a complete, the slightest relationship she would visit. Anyway, cut a long story short, this gregarious lady, stroke, bad. Like that, and killed and wizened. Anyway, my cousin and I would go and see her on a Sunday in Fadei. But what used to strike me is we would go and it was terrible. You see his mum, and within 5 minutes of our leaving, we would be out and about, and his friends, because he was so popular, and they would go, Gabi, like some of you may know, Gabi, and he was away. He was away, you wouldn't know that anything had happened. And that, I took something from that, because ultimately it didn't make any difference to her whether he was crying outside or not. So I think that was relevant. But the point I'm trying to make is it doesn't matter how gregarious or accomplished you are. Hypertension causes us a lot of stroke relative to the white population, relative to any other population. One consolation, if you can call it a consolation, although it's probably a warning, is that the African Americans high blood pressure, or they suffer greater complications from their high blood pressure than we are so far. But that may be an element of how long they've been there. Because I've got a slide, which I don't know whether it's here or not. There is a slide that I saw, which seemed to suggest that the longer your stay in diaspora, the more likely it is, even age adjusted, the more likely it is that you are to complain of something, to have something limited. And that it passes down the generations. It passes down the generations. For example, that's why I think that if whatever you think about your own health status now, a lot of what happens around you can transmit down the generations. For example, not particularly related to health disparity, but I thought I'd share it with you, and because it alarmed me. The incidence of any sort of mental condition for Caribbean immigrants to the United States, first generation is 19%, second generation 35%, and third generation 55%. But it's not this serious, but just any. It's just a headline figure, any sort. So it could be mild, this and that. But the fact that it got worse is telling you something about the atmosphere, the ambience. Next, please. Diabetes, you don't need to be told. The two big complications are two correlates of diabetes and weight. We've got problems with obesity in Nigeria, we've got them here. So it's reversible. It's one of those things we call a reversible risk factor. They go together, and it's associated with an increased risk of kidney disease. So the two big killers of Nigerians, African Americans, whatever way you want to define us, are hypertension and diabetes. If we can't get those under control, then life expectancy and healthy lives, the length of time we spend living healthily, would improve. So why? I referred to the noise for Vandermouth earlier on, people saying it's all genetics and so on. Genes play a part, but genes play a part solely, linearly, in only about 2% of conditions. Most conditions are as a result of an interaction, complicated interaction between our genetic makeup, the environment, behavioral patterns. Behavioral patterns will be smoking, how much leisure you take, the diet. Social circumstances would be education, the wealth, whether you have access to green spaces, and so on. For example, we're not holding this meeting in my bedroom, for example. It would be fun, but you wouldn't be comfortable. You wouldn't be comfortable. So you need access to space to be able to relax. And one of the sadnesses is that people don't appreciate that the softer, non-financial rewards are almost as important as financial remuneration. So social circumstances and so on. So these factors that I put up before, they are themselves determined by what we call the social determinants of health. In other words, whether you have a nice house and so on is determined by the sort of things we all want. A stable home, stable family life, good education, fulfilling work, good income, psychological and physical security. And when all those fail, when things go wrong, we want to have access to good health care. So those are the social determinants of health, which interact with our genetic makeup. But the makeup, it's not, the interaction is not like a football, one or the other. It's a very complicated mix, and we may come to that later on. So what is important about the society is how are those social determinants of health shared? Are they shared by free markets? Friedman says if anything can happen. If they want to smoke, let them smoke. As long as money is made, it doesn't really matter. Or is it by Marx? Or is it by Hitler? Or Kagame, since we're talking of Rwanda. Stalin, Rawls, theory of justice. Is it by the theory of justice, which implies that, in a way, the least should be brought up, improved before those who have more? Or is it like utilitarianism? You do the best for the greatest number, regardless of redistribution. So there are many philosophical underpinnings to the way society is organized. So you need to know how these social determinants are shared so that you are able to judge and explain health disparities. So COVID, for example, if you know the basis on which social determinants of health were shared, you can judge the government. You can say, this is the reason why Africans died during COVID. Or you can see where we went wrong. You can see how we can improve. You can see how you can compare one country with the other country. But also it goes to the core of justice. You want to know how things that are supposed to be for everybody are shared, because it goes to the heart of social cohesion. So it's important to know what is just, what is justifiable. If you are going to have inequality, is it justifiable or unjustifiable, or is it inevitable? So I take the view that many of these determinants are shared in a way that can be modified, which is why we're here this evening. Next, please. Now, to give you an example, during COVID, or shortly after COVID, they had a nursing survey which showed that relative to white nurses, the black nurses had a disadvantage. We all know that PPE, personal protective equipment, there was a challenge, let's call it a challenge, for the country to acquire. And there was a difference between black and white nurses. The white nurses were more likely to say that they had adequate equipment, and they were less likely to be asked to reuse. Or turn it around, black nurses were more likely to be asked to reuse, and they were less likely to report that they had adequate equipment. But across both groups, neither group had adequate equipment. Everybody should have. It should have been 100% both sides. So there was a deficiency anyway, and it is within the shortage that we have this. These are bold figures. I don't know why this happened. There may be very good reasons why these figures are like this, which goes back to the heart of what I was saying before. which is, if you don't know the rules, you can't judge what has happened, and it can lead to misinterpretation. So we need to know what we're doing with social determinants of health, education, housing, and so on. So if we need to advance, to improve, we need to know where we went wrong. James Baldwin said, it's one of my favorite quotes, James Baldwin said, you cannot change everything you face, but nothing will change unless you face it. And I add to that, unless you let it change you. You've got to change as well. And racism is like sex. It's deniable. Even our parents denied it. But you see the effects all around you. And they will say something like, I don't know where I got you from. Then a toddling past will say, I know because mommy told me. So the question is, it happens. And everybody says, well, colorblind, nothing, well, we're so perfect. But we've seen the phenotype, what we call genotype and phenotype. The phenotype is what emerges that we see. All the other stuff is happening behind doors. And it has a long history. It's practiced differently in different countries. So you will see Brazilians, you will see Hispanics. Hispanics is a one in question. Very interesting as I was reading around this topic. Hispanics, some will identify as white, some will identify as black. And there's a difference in their health trajectory. If you define yourself Hispanic white, your life is different. Hispanic black, your life is different. What sort of society is that? And racism is always wrong. It's abominable. It is shocking and inhumane. I use those two words borrowed from MLK when he was describing health inequalities. But I think even before you get to health inequalities, you've got racism. Because if you look around the world, it underpins almost every conflict. It underpins almost every inequality. And we are not going to be able to abolish it or change it unless we face it, unless we accept that it's playing a part. So if you think that it is going to present drooling and barking and dribbling saliva, you will miss it. It more or less presents like this: pretty, demure, beguiling, in all shapes and forms and races. Don't think that because somebody speaks public school English that they cannot have a knife up your children's backside. Because what we're talking about now is the legacy we're going to leave for those we've brought onto this planet. Because if we do not help in that little short way to improve this society, why would you leave your child in that situation without at least trying? That's the spirit with which I accepted the honor to speak tonight. So it's like that, and it affects this thing that is denied, like sex, this thing that is denied, the impact it has on our lives comes through direct face-to-face contact at work and so on, leisure, through institutional contacts, our interaction with institutions, the police service, educational service, and so on, tax office. And when we're ill, the health delivery system. So I'll give you some examples. For example, there is a big review of inequalities as a group, carried out by an August professor, I think a Nobel Prize winner called Anders Deaton, and it's set up with the Institute of Fiscal Studies, and there are lots of people who have been writing different parts of this, and they're written in Oxford Economics if anybody's interested, but they're written under the aegis of the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And one of the articles I read by Heidi Merzer, Professor Heidi Merzer, Emeritus Professor UCL, and Ross Warwick, was that whenever you look, whatever stratum of society you look at, in spite, I put all these here, in spite of our body, you know, they say your shoes will make a ka noise if you study. So you study, and we've got all these certificates. Some we brought from Nigeria. Then they said they didn't like them. Then we had more. We added more. And we added more. So in spite of those certificates, our median income is about £50,000 median, which is about the same as everybody in the United Kingdom, whether they went to university or not. In other words, Joe Bloggs and you are just about on par in relation to income. But they also found that whenever they looked, there was an unexplained wage gap. In other words, all of you here, even Goldman Sachs people, what's the name of the other? Morgan people, JP Morgan, as you're sitting here counting your yachts, other people have more for the same job. Now, you may be happy because you're saying, well, at least I'm here. That's all very well and good. But what about the kids? So do we want to bequeath that to the kids as well? So when my son, there was one occasion, in fact, I nearly got into trouble. So my son came, I said, you've been working for these people, because he's very clever. James is very clever. So it's one of those things, it just happens. I don't know how I don't know where I got him from. So he's working. He's working. And I'm thinking, what's happening with your pay rise or something? And he said, well, they're saying they haven't got the budget. They haven't got the budget. So in my head, I'm reverting to Nigerian boomerang psychology. Think, they're cheating my son. They're cheating my son. Come on. And it cut a long story short. He began to take, I didn't tell him, but I just felt uneasy. I thought, they're cheating my boy. And nobody likes the boy to be cheated. I don't know whether he was cheated, but I just felt that something is wrong. They keep saying there's no budget. How can they not have a budget for somebody who's working? Doing all this thing, and I know my boy's good. So, and I'm biased, but I know he's good. Anyway, cut a long story short, so he resigned. He resigned, and he was headhunted, he went to another thing. But he didn't like it. Fortunately, COVID came. So when COVID came, he was almost going to get trapped because he didn't like the other people. They also promised him something they didn't deliver. So luckily, the other people forgave him, so he came back. So he went back yes, but you see the mental hustle that is involved with watching television in another man's house that you won't see on balance sheets. But as I will show you, it makes a difference to your core. So this is the equivalent for the United States. The United States, in fact, I don't even need to show you this slide. If I say to you, if I close my eyes now and say, everybody's working in America, who do you think would get the most money for the same job? You will know. So let me just erase the slide.